Hey there, and welcome back into the Integrative Health Simplified podcast. I'm Kari, Coody, your host, and we are in season 1, episode 15. And we're in the middle of a series titled Common Health Misconceptions because there are a lot of those, I feel. So today we are going to talk about sugar. And sugar is something that oftentimes gets a very bad rap when it comes to being healthy. You need to cut out all sugar. And I do feel like that is a common health misconception that I definitely fell in the trap of. And so that's what we're going to kind of break down and talk about today in this episode. So, is sugar the enemy? I think it's really important when we think about this conversation to talk about and kind of give context to sugar and how it works in your body. So, sugar is essentially just basically glucose and fructose that is broken down and used within our body. We can see this in nature, like cane sugar or beet sugar, and that's kind of like the most basic type that we see. And so these two parts that it's broken down to do have function in our body. And so I do just want to just give a disclaimer. Nobody is sitting here telling you that even though maybe it's not necessarily the enemy, it is not something that you should be eating in copious amounts. Not telling you that you should eat copious amounts of white sugar and everything is going to be well with your health. But sugar is actually quite metabolic. And by that, I mean that it helps to support your metabolism. So honestly, a lot of times sugar is not necessarily the problem in general. It's really just sometimes white sugar doesn't have a lot of nutritional content. And so why is that a problem? But first, I kind of want to go back to metabolism. Like, how does it support the metabolism and really defining your metabolism? So the metabolism is just the basic function of our cell, right? Our metabolism is how our body gets energy. And so at the basic level, our body runs off of this glucose and fructose for energy for our cells, right? And so that's kind of what happens at a basic level whenever our body needs to run, right? Our metabolism needs to be supported. And that's why sugar is actually quite supportive to the metabolism. But as I mentioned, white sugar, because a lot of times when we think about sugar, we do think about white sugar. And so the issue with white sugar is that it doesn't have a lot of nutritional content. That doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't have any purpose. It just kind of lacks nutrition. And so anytime that you want to increase, your metabolic rate, you need to make sure you have all the cofactors that are coming along with that sugar source. Because again, our body does run off of this glucose. That's its preferred form, right? We'll talk about a lot of different organs and things need this glucose to run off of, but it also needs cofactors like vitamins and minerals to run off of also. So that just means that the nutrition is important, that it's there in all of the cofactors needed. And so when we think about speeding things up, we're going to be using more minerals. We're going to be using more nutrients. While we also need that glucose, we're going to need more of these things as well. And so I think it's important to just consider what type of sugar or glucose source that you are consuming. And so really you want to consume things that have both glucose and or fructose, and they also have other nutritional benefits. These are things like fruits and roots and dairy and milk and honey and possibly even like maple syrup, things like that. We're going to be getting both energy and nutrition from those things, which is really, really important when you think about it in the whole grand scheme of things. And so white sugar isn't necessarily bad, but it can be utilized purposely by our body. But for a lot of, for the reason of it lacks nutrition, that's an issue with, I'm just going to consume a lot of white sugar. Definitely not what I'm saying to do. But I am saying that it can have a place, and it's actually pretty easy to digest and a quick source of energy to our body. But again, it doesn't have a lot of nutritious benefits to it. But really, what I see as the issue is that a lot of times it's what you consume the sugar with. It's not like people are just really consuming like spoonfuls of white sugar. They're eating it with other types of foods, or I guess I should say in other types of foods like cookies and cakes. And these sweet foods are not just sugar. They also most likely contain some polyunsaturated fats, which aren't that great for us. They could contain grains, things that might cause inflammation response in our body if we're sensitive to those types of things. Not to mention that they're highly palatable. So they're very, very easy to overeat. And so I think sometimes it's that overconsumption that can really create the problem, not necessarily sugar itself. But again, the sugar gets the bad rap as in a general sense versus really looking at what the problem is. And so instead of sugar creating the problem and really saying, I'm not going to eat any sweets, that can really become the problem in itself, is actually the restriction of sugar. Because again, our body runs off glucose, which basically is sugar broken down. And so when we restrict the most basic form of energy that our body needs, it's just kind of a knee-jerk reaction that it's going to start screaming at us to consume more fuel. And so sometimes when we restrict it, we actually can tend to overconsume those types of foods because it's kind of like a rebound effect. And so a lot of times people feel very unstable around sugar. And I can definitely understand this because just a little bit, sort of a pause here, just to share a little bit about my story. So in some of the previous episodes, I talked about how I've definitely fallen victim to the extreme mentality when it comes to cutting out certain foods, restrictive eating. And I was definitely under eating carbs. We'll talk about that. I wasn't probably eating enough calories in general, and I had cut out all refined sugar. Now, again, not saying that was, I mean, it might have served a purpose at the time, but whenever I cut out all refined sugar, I'm putting that in quotation marks. If you're not watching the video, if you're watching the podcast, that's air quotes. I think I tend to undereat all forms of sugar, like carbs in the form of fruit. I definitely still like root veggies, but they're not quite as dense in glucose. And I was not eating, really much of anything sweet. And so I would really feel like I just need to have something sweet after every meal. And I would tend to want to go back and back and back in the cabinet and just continue to eat those things. And I would kind of overeat and then not feel good and then feel like, oh, okay, I need to just cut out all this. And it was a lot of black and white thinking. That's what I'm getting at. And so I think that this subject is really a important one to consider, in the fact of, do you feel like you can be trusted around sweets and sugar? Again, I think it's important to think about the context of sugar and how you are consuming it. Are you consuming a lot of cookies and cakes and things like that? Or is it just, sugar in your coffee, or sugar sprinkled over some fruit? Or, it's really important to think about how you're consuming that sugar, because again, we tend to overeat the things that are super palatable because of the things that are added to the sugar. So I think that's really an interesting thing to think about. And why don't you feel like you can trust yourself around sugar? Because it's honestly not the enemy. And I want to try to change your thought process around that, because I feel like it's a really important one, just to try to help you get out of this black and white thinking. So that's just kind of a personal story for me. And I'll share at the end sort of what, if you do feel like you can't be trusted around these things, what I would like you to try to focus on more and see if it helps, because that's what it really helped for me. So we'll share that. I'll share that in just a minute. But again, this just goes back to biology. Our cells prefer to use glucose for fuel. If you think about blood sugar, that's sugar. That's what helps our blood sugar remain stable. And so it's not blood fat, it's not blood protein. Those things are needed, but it's blood sugar. And so your cells prefer to use glucose as an energy source, right? We have something that's called blood sugar. So it makes sense that way. And so the argument is, hey, what if you're thinking, all right, I've read, you've done some research on this, like our body doesn't necessarily need sugar because it can produce its own. Okay, that's definitely correct, but let's talk about that for a minute. So you can actually give your body zero sugar. You can go on a keto-based diet. You can have no sugar in your body and you can totally survive. That is absolutely correct, because your body will produce its own sugar. This is a process called gluconeogenesis. It's kind of a longer word. We learned about this in pharmacy school. It's where your body can break down protein or muscle and so forth, like to make its own sugar, make its own energy source. And so it can keep you alive. However, it does come at a cost. But that really is how important sugar is to your body. Your body actually has a process, like a backup process, to create its own sugar and energy source. Pretty cool. However, that process comes at a cost because it does break down muscle and tissue in order to make its own sugar. Because again, your body is trying to survive at all cost. So it's really important to remember that there are certain body functions and body organs that can only utilize sugar as energy, like your brain. Your brain can run off of ketones, but really it can only do that for a certain amount of time. And then there's going to be some serious cost to that because it's not the preferred source of energy. But other things like our red blood cells, our liver, a lot of our organs need glucose to run off of. And so in a previous episode, I shared about how I realized that a lot of my digestive issues, sluggish digestive system, was kind of, if I looked up the detox funnel, it was actually my liver that was really struggling. And I do really think it was because I was not getting enough glucose into my body. And so my liver was very sluggish. My metabolic function was very sluggish because it really didn't have the fuel that it needed. And so that was affecting me personally in the way of my digestive system. And so I think that can show up in a lot of different ways because we are all, individuals. And so our body is going to show us signs in different ways. But that was my sign. I didn't realize that for years and years, but looking back, I feel like that was a really big piece to my puzzle. And so knowing these organs need glucose to run off of, I think it would make sense to look at, are we giving our body enough glucose to run off of? And so again, it can make its own glucose. It can do that because our body is absolutely amazing. However, it is going to come at a cost, and it's obviously we want to preserve our muscles and tissues, and we don't want to lose muscle because we're not giving our body the source of energy that it needs. And so it's going to have to break down its actually own body. Our body can break down its own tissues. However, obviously we don't want it to do that if we don't have to. Obviously, we want it to do that if we are stuck out in the middle of on a mountain and we don't have food. Yes, please do that because I want to stay alive. However, let's give our body like at the basic at the basic energy source what it wants to run off of, and that is glucose. And so just a takeaway here, kind of wrapping up this topic. Sugar shouldn't be the enemy because of our basic metabolic need for glucose. But if, I get how in the form that it's consumed really matters. And so if you feel uncontrollable around sugar, it's likely a deeper rooted issue. Now, this could be very multidimensional. I get sometimes bacterial overgrowth can cause you to crave sugar. Like that's just one, for instance. However, I want you to just consider this. If you do feel uncontrollable around sugar, like you just can't really get enough and you're always wanting something sweet, even after, now I'm not talking about like a small piece of dark chocolate or something, right? I don't think that's an issue. I think it's really just like when we consume copious amounts, we can't really stop ourselves, if you will, kind of tend to like binge on those things. I would really first want you to consider, are you consuming enough carbs? Because this was my issue and I didn't even realize it. It wasn't like I was like, oh, I'm going to go low carb. It was more like, oh, I woke up and realized I'm not eating enough calories overall and I'm not eating enough carbs. Even fruits can get demonized. And I know you know this because, I've definitely been there. I was eating super, super low sugar fruits or hardly any fruits really. And so I want you to just know like fruit is an actual amazing source of glucose because it has a lot of nutritional density to the food, right? It's not just like we're talking about white sugar. I get white sugar can have somewhat of a role. It's not completely the enemy. However, like we said, mostly it's what we're consuming with that white sugar. But when we think about something like higher sugar fruits that maybe we've been staying away from because, again, we thought sugar was the enemy. These are maybe things like pineapple or mango. Kiwi's not super high in sugar, but it is one that I didn't necessarily think of. I was eating mainly berries, which are known to be lower in sugar. even a banana. That's something that like I didn't eat for a really long time. So these are all things that we hear and we kind of take as the gospel, but honestly, they can contain a lot of good nutritional benefit along with that good glucose source. Obviously, you want to consume carbs with a protein source and probably a little bit of fat. So that's definitely something you want to consider. But I just want you to think about if you feel uncontrollable around sugar, and if you've just cut sugar out and you maybe try to add it back in and you still feel like you just go crazy over it, just look and see if you're consuming enough carbs, especially maybe like higher sugar carbs, because again, they do contain a lot of nutritional benefits to them, nutritional density. And if you consume them with enough protein, they're not going to negatively affect your blood sugar, maybe like they have in the past. And that's kind of a whole other conversation, right? If you haven't been consuming carbs because of blood sugar, I think that's part of a deeper issue. But again, I'm going to stay on the track of, is sugar the enemy? I hope that you have just gotten some really good information and maybe just can look at this in a different way now. And again, trying to get us out of this black and white thinking that is so rampant in this space, and really just look at like, what did God give us to eat? Like, he gave us all foods to enjoy. And I get that doesn't mean that everybody can enjoy everything right now. Maybe you really are going through something in your health and you need to cut something out for a short amount of time. But again, short amount of time and then years and years, those are two very different things. And so I don't want you to hear me say something is wrong with you because, you might have a negative reaction to these things. I get that there might be an underlying issue with that too. But again, I think it's a great conversation to start. I would love to continue this conversation with you. As always, you can feel free to email me. You can feel free to message me on Instagram. Those are two great ways to kind of continue this conversation. And if you really just love this episode and want to like get this information out there, I would just be honored if you would share this with your followers, with your family and friends, anybody that you think would really benefit from this information. Because again, the holistic health world is kind of overwhelming and it's kind of confusing, and there are some misconceptions out there. So that's what I'm trying to kind of address in this series. So I hope you're enjoying it, and I will see you on the next episode.